Warning: the podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast, the Overdose Murder of Bobbie Jean Blacka miniseries, Episode 3 of 4. Episode 2 was very informative. Why don't you tell us what we can expect as we go into Episode 3?
3 carries this case really easily. It picks up on the fact that some of the preliminary investigative efforts had taken place that Bobbie talked about in Episode 2. Now he starts to go deeper. Now he starts to talk more about contacting more people as the picture became more clear. We're going to see why when he first got to this, why it didn't appear to be just another overdose. I know that's a callous way of putting it, but that's the way they are, that something inside Bobbie talked to him, his intuition, and it began to play out very well in the rest of the investigation. So we're going to see what it's like in Episode 3 when he starts to interview more people, and as he gets closer to the truth. We've had more than one detective on this case talk about how they'll interview somebody, and while they don't think they ever get the full truth, they get as close to the truth as they're going to get, and we'll hear that too. We're also going to find out, too, that Bobbie wasn't the only one that had his heart set on this and was really working diligently. He was blessed to have a district attorney's office in his jurisdiction that spent a lot of time doing research on case law and things like to evaluate whether accountability could be held in this case. So we'll hear a lot about that.
Okay, well, let's get into Episode 3.
Later on in the day, Daisy actually contacts me. I don't have to reach out back to her. She contacts the police department and says, hey, Corporal McKone wanted to talk. I'm awake now. I'm good. I'd like to talk to him if he wants to come back up and do another interview. So I go back up there, and this is where the story really starts to change. I lock her into another interview. The details start to get different from what they were from the first interview. Ultimately, I ended up doing 4 interviews with Daisy. The 4th one that I did, she says, I've had enough of lying. I don't want to hide anymore, even if this means that I get in trouble and I go to jail. I cannot lie to you anymore. I'm going to tell you what happened. She goes on to explain the story. This is the actual closest to the truth that I believe that we actually got. I do believe there was some details that were still fuzzy. There was still some things that didn't add up and still some things that were untruthful. But I think her recollection of the 4th statement she gave me is finally as close to the truth as what we could get. She explains to me that the night before we found the victim's body in the apartment complex, John Davis picks up Melissa Stewart and Christina Nicole Pierce, and they drive to Cumberland, Maryland, which I explained before, West Virginia is 10 minutes away from Maryland, so this is probably a 30-minute drive to go to one of our larger cities in Maryland, and there's a lot of drug activity there because they go from that point to Maryland, they go to Baltimore and get the drugs and bring it back. He goes to Cumberland, Maryland, and picks up heroin at a Sheetz gas station. It's kind of like a Wawa or a Circle K. Up north, we have Sheetz's. So it's a Sheetz gas station, and they go there and pick up the drugs on the corner from a guy that John Davis knows to be a drug dealer. So, of course, I'm trying to get details about the car. I don't know if they have any paraphernalia in the car, if I can get a search warrant, if that's a good starting point. So I'm asking her a lot of questions about the car. And she says, I'm really not a car person. I can't tell you if something's a Ford versus a Chevy. I don't know cars. I know it was a very, very tiny, little older box car. Probably had 200,000 miles on it. It was a very old, beat-up car. It was blue, like a light color blue, and it was only a 2-door because she said, I went outside and they all had to squeeze into this little car, all 3 of them, and it was a very tiny little 2-seater with a small seat in the back car. Like I said, my jurisdiction was only 4,000 people, very small city, very small town. I was able to eventually drive through the town and find this car. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that as we get into this. So she explains to me they come back later on that night. Their trip was successful. They went to Cumberland, Maryland. They picked up an undisclosed amount of heroin. And she said, I'm not a heroin user. I smoke weed. I don't know how much it was. It was a bag or a sack of heroin. When I'm trying to get her to describe it, do you know if it was laced with anything? Did John say, they called him John Boy. So did John Boy say that it was cut with anything? Did it have any other drugs in it? Do you know how big the bag was? The way she described it to me, I'm guessing it was probably 5 grams of heroin. So she says they're in the apartment, they're drinking, they're smoking weed, they're partying. And she says that Bobbie Jean Blacka says, I used to use heroin, but I haven't used it in a long time. I'm kind of going through a rough patch right now with marital problems and some stress. I just want to get high and go to sleep and forget about my life for a little bit. She goes, I'm really nervous shooting up. I never liked needles going into my arm. Will somebody else do it? We were never able to find out who the individual was that actually put the needle in Bobbie's arm and injected the heroin, but somebody prepped the heroin for her and put it into her arm and shot her up. They said immediately she felt the effects of the heroin, she was on the corner of the bed, and we call it on the nod in law enforcement. It's when somebody becomes very sleepy and lethargic and their head starts to drop, kind of like you're falling asleep in class kind of syndrome. You can't help it. You can't keep your eyes open. Your head's falling asleep. If you've seen anybody under the influence of alcohol, they'll kind of do that same thing when they get really sleepy and drunk. And she comes to the point where she actually passes out, falls off the edge of the bed, and she does hit her face on the corner of the entertainment stand. At this point, she's laying face down with her neck kind of bent sideways against the entertainment stand, and they grab her and roll her over to her back, and that's when they start dumping the water and putting the ice packs on her groin and trying to wake her up. Daisy at this point confesses to me in statement number 4 that they tried to feel for a pulse, and all of them were so messed up that the one girl who said she was a CNA says, I don't know if I'm doing it right, but I can't feel a pulse, and it doesn't look like she's breathing. So they all collected the heroin, left the apartment with the heroin because of that law we talked about earlier. They were in fear of calling for the ambulance and afraid the police would show up and they would all be arrested for possession of heroin, which is a felony in West Virginia. It's a Schedule II narcotic. It's a felony. So they all collected the heroin and they leave her body in the bedroom, close the door, and they leave for the night and leave her in there.
Did Daisy give an answer? If you're going to remove it, fine. You don't want to get arrested. Why did they not call for an ambulance when they left with the heroin and say, make up a lie? We just got home and found her. Why wait till tomorrow?
That was absolutely the question that I asked. And she began to cry at that point, and you could tell emotionally that's where she had that conviction. And she said, you're absolutely right. We should have. And I don't know why we didn't do that. And I have no excuse for that. We should have. And I said, even if you guys would have been arrested for it, don't you think a human being's life would have been worth calling? And what if the ambulance could have came and gave her Narcan and saved her life? And again, she lost it, hysterically crying. And at this point, she lost all physical control of her body. Her knees began to buckle. She hit the ground and just sobbed in the corner and said, I know, we should have called for help.
Wow. So she willingly gives you the name to John Boy and Melissa and Christina, and you find the little Yugo or Chevette.
Yeah. I think it was like a blue Ford Festiva, if memory serves me correct. This was 6 years ago, so it was one of those cars, in college that you pile 9 people into, but really only 3 fit.
And I'm guessing some of our listeners won't even know what a Yugo or a Chevette is. I'm showing my age.
Just think of the circus when all the clowns came piling out.
Right. Yeah, one of those little clown cars painted blue is exactly what it was. So I'm just on routine patrol, and I'm one of those people. I'm an extremely analytical thinker. And in cases like this, would drive me nuts because I'll analyze it every which way, and I want to get that missing piece. And I'm just driving around my jurisdiction on a slow day, kind of answering other calls as they come in, and I come across this blue car that's actually parked off the street. It's physically parked in someone's backyard. And I go up and knock on the door, and I'm like, hey, sir, do you got a minute? Can I just talk to you? And he's like, yeah, what's going on? And I was like, do you happen to know a guy named John Davis? And he goes, yeah, that's my nephew. And I said, I said, so does he borrow that car frequently? And he goes, yeah, he borrows it all the time. So, of course, I began to talk to him and build that rapport with him. Did he happen to borrow it on the evening of? He got the car. He took it that whole entire night and brought it back the next day. So I was able to get a statement which put all of them in that vehicle. He was able to confirm that he took the car, and to his knowledge, when I said, sir, do you know where he was going to go with the car? He told me he was going to a party down at this apartment complex and said he had to run to Cumberland, Maryland first. So he was able to corroborate certain aspects and pieces of Daisy's story, that they did go to Cumberland to pick up narcotics and then went back to this apartment complex where they were going to use the narcotics. So he was able to give me a written statement in that. He gave me consent to search the car. The car smelled like weed, but I did not recover any evidence whatsoever from the vehicle. At that point, I'm calling the gas station in Maryland. Hey, can I get copies of your security surveillance footage? I know that I'm out of state. I can have the district attorney in Maryland draw up paperwork, and we can do an interstate, compact type thing to do a joint investigation and cooperate on this. They were like, no problem. If you're a law enforcement officer, just drive down here and, present yourself in uniform. And once we know you're a cop, we own the video and the camera feed. We'll give it to you without a subpoena or without a search warrant. We'll sign a chain of custody paper and voluntarily provide that evidence to you. I get down there and take a look at the security surveillance footage that's located on the exterior of the building in the hopes of getting that blue car and maybe identify another suspect vehicle of who the person that delivered the drugs to John Boy was and where they had parked. From where they explained it to me later on in the statement, they were outside of the view of the camera. So I did not get any security surveillance footage from the gas station that was able to line up with the evidence that I collected throughout the case.
Was Uncle able to tell you where John Boy was?
He says he's kind of a drifter, as with most of these people that you're identified with law enforcement, that have substance abuse issues. We call them couch surfers. A lot of them will kind of just bounce around from family member to family member, friend to friend, sleep on couches. They sleep on their cars. And a lot of times it's really sad, but they do that because they burnt bridges with a lot of people. Dave and I were talking before we started the podcast session this morning, and I told him, I said, half my family is law enforcement and the other half are criminals. I've arrested my cousin. She had a meth lab in her house in my jurisdiction. She had a meth lab in her house with 2 little babies in the residence. Put her in state prison. My brother's arrested my aunt. He's arrested a cousin of mine for probation violation. And with a lot of those people that have those substance abuse issues, my cousin, for example, he would go into his mom and dad's house, and the day after Christmas, they would come out and see their 70-inch flat screen TV gone off the shelf, knowing that he took it. He'd take it down the street and sell it for $20 and go get a hit of heroin or go get an oxy pill. You're talking $1,000 TV, and he would get high. He burnt those bridges with his family so much that they told him, you're not welcome back in this house. You just keep using us and you keep burning those bridges. So they have to go house to house in order to avoid being homeless.
Right.
And a lot of times they do end up on the street because of that narcotics addiction.
So John Boy was this type of drifter, you learn. And with Melissa and Christina, were they kind of the same thing, or were they more established than John Boy?
No, they were all kind of the same. They all had substance abuse issues. They all had criminal histories, been in and out of trouble with the law. So just to paint a picture, John Boy was the oldest. He was 36 years old. And you had Melissa Stewart, who was 22. Our victim was 38. And then you have Christina Nicole Pierce, 21, and then Daisy was 31. So we have them all scattered kind of throughout their early 20s to early 30s, Bobbie Jean and John Boy being the oldest of the two. So that's kind of that age gap that kind of goes, into that. And of course, they all said, we grew up together. It's a small town. We knew one another through family connections and known associates. We've been partying together for a long time, that kind of thing. So Daisy's painting this picture. I'm able to finally get in touch with John Boy. He comes down and talks to me, same thing. A lot of body language is telling me he's being deceitful. I'm able to tell him, I'm not going to discuss with you who gave me these statements, but I know you did this, and this. I'm already ahead of the game. You can play ball with me and really, tell me what happened and fill in these missing pieces and let me know what's going on. Again, he was very, no, it wasn't me. I don't know anything about that. We didn't do that kind of thing. He never invoked his right to legal counsel. He did give me a voluntary confession, but it was 100% untruthful. So I couldn't really do a whole lot with what he was telling me. I was able to make several phone calls, and I got in touch with Christina Nicole Pierce's mother and kind of told her, hey, I really need to talk to your daughter. She says the same thing. She's hit or miss. She'll go months at a time and I won't hear from her. She'll be on the run from the law. She'll have warrants in her name. I don't know where she's at. And I said, well, I make you this promise to build this rapport to you. I have checked her name in the criminal database system. She does not have any outstanding warrants at all. And you have my word, if she comes in and talks to me and fills in the pieces of this, she will walk out of this police department the same exact day. You have my word on that. They both come down. I tell Mom, I understand you want to be in the room, and I thank you for bringing her down here, but she's a grown woman. She's 21 years old. I need you to wait into the lobby out here in the police department. I can't let you in the interview room because she's going to act differently with you in the room and not be truthful about some things. Can you at least do that for me? And everybody that I met throughout this investigation, with the exception of Christina Pierce, was very, very helpful, and they wanted to assist law enforcement, which later on, I know we have some questions that are built in, people that are kind of going against law enforcement and making the investigation a little more difficult. Lucky for me, I did have people with the extent of some of the suspects that knew that they were going to be in trouble that were a little bit untruthful. But all in all, they were very, hey, we want to help, we want to assist. They were very kind to me. They were welcoming to have me ask them questions and participate. So Christina comes into the room.
Mom
And
leaves. Mom goes out.
Yeah, well, Mom's in the lobby. Christina comes into the interview room. Again, I give her her Miranda warnings. She waives her right to legal counsel. I'm going to give you a voluntary confession. She's more than happy to point the finger at everybody else. She's one of those, I was there, but I'm kind of guilty by association. It was John Boy, it was Melissa, it was Daisy, it was everybody else. It wasn't me. I had nothing to do with any of this. So she does tell me something interesting, though. She says that she was the one that collected the heroin needles, the hypodermic syringes, but she says it was to benefit other people because she didn't want somebody to come into that room and stub their toe on an open cap needle kind of thing. She was doing it to be kind and to be responsible and to be a good person. But I asked her, I said, so what happened to the needles and to the narcotics? And she said, well, the narcotics we finished using. She said the needles, we took them over and threw them in the Potomac River off of Water Street in my jurisdiction. That is a fishing hole where people in our community go to catch fish, and it's where kids in our community go to jump in the river and swim. So she threw those needles into a swimming hole where a lot of kids go that could have
stepped on them,
affected those children. So I told her, if you're that concerned about keeping people safe from an open cap needle, why'd you throw them in the river where kids swim? And she looked at me and said, that's not my problem.
Oh, wow.
So she was the one that was very difficult to work with because she was not happy to see me, and she was very nasty during the interview, did not want to play nice at all with these kind of things. That was a difficult interview. Later on in the court part of this that we'll get into with the court phase of it, we had our felony preliminary hearings, and her attorney questioned me on the fact that, was it true that Christina Nicole Pierce was under the influence of a controlled substance when she did the interview with you? So therefore, anything that she told you is inadmissible in court because she didn't have the capability of giving a clear-minded confession or a statement because she was under the influence of heroin. So I really had to articulate, on the stand that based on my training and experience, where I was certified as an advanced roadside impaired driving officer, it's kind of the step that you take before a drug recognition expert for anybody that knows anything about traffic enforcement and interdiction. You're kind of trained and you specialize in knowing the adverse effects on the body. It's a little bit further than your standard field sobriety that you do for drunk drivers, where you do the horizontal gaze nystagmus and the walk and turn test, those kind of things. You do a little bit further into the evaluation stage, and I could tell him, I said, she did not have pinpoint and fixed pupils during the interview. She was not lethargic. She did not slur her words. She didn't appear to have that slouch in her body. She was very clear-minded. She could, respond well. She was processing what I was telling her well, so I was able to articulate that, and the judge ultimately ruled that her statement was admissible because I acted in good faith to believe that she was not under the influence. But I'll talk a little bit later in our follow-up questions on how that changed the way that I did interview and interrogation from that point forward based on what happened in court. You always want to get better and learn from,
right.
mistake that you might have done or get better. So that was a challenge for me during that case.
Well,
but she was able to...
I apologize. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, with Christina giving you some attitude and a hard time, did you find that John Boy and Melissa were the same way, or did they seem more open to your questions?
They seem more open, and several times, it's kind of like if you've done interview and interrogation for any point in time, you'll realize when somebody gives you those definitive exclamatory statements of, I really, really want to help you, officer. I really want to help you, detective. That's an aversion of some form, that they're not wanting to truly help you, because if they did, they'd be telling you the truth and they wouldn't be stumbling, making up answers in their head as you're going through the interview. And both of them said things like that. I really, really want to help you. And it wasn't until I was able to read the body language of Melissa when she finally broke down and said, I can't take this anymore. I have to come out and I have to confess and I have to tell you what happened, even if it means that I'm going to be in trouble. When she said that, I knew in my head before I even did the interview, this is as close to the truth as what we're going to get. Did
she closely match Daisy's fourth confession?
She did. A lot of the details were spot on, and they did match up. And of course, I asked Daisy, now that you're working with me and you're being honest, I want you to be honest. Has John Boy or Christina or anybody else reached back out to you to try to corroborate your stories and make sure everything matches up? Is this staged in any way? Is anything they're going to tell me, is it going to be staged? And she says, no, I haven't talked to him since the night that we partied. And you can look at my phone. She threw her phone right on the desk. You can search my call log and my text message history. Now, again, she could have deleted it. But at that point, I felt fairly certain that she was being truthful to say, there's my phone. You can look in it without a warrant. You have my consent. I have not talked to any of them since the day that we called 911.
Wow. So at this point, you interview your 4 people, and I know you got convictions on 3 of them. What ends up happening with Daisy?
Basically, with Melissa, she was on the run. She had a federal warrant, and for the life of me, I can't remember what her charges were, but I do know that the feds were looking at her, and she was hiding out, sleeping in someone's barn, like, three counties away. And I was able to coordinate with the federal agency, and I can't even remember what agency it was. I do know that it was a federal warrant, and I think it might have been the sheriff's office in the county she was living that was able to get her into custody and then transfer custody over to the feds. They did a fugitive from justice warrant on her and transfer her to federal custody. So I never did get a chance to talk to Melissa Stewart. She never came forward. I did file formal charges on all of them. Once I was able to coordinate with the deputy that was in that county, I said, look, I know she's going to be transferred to federal custody, but I also have this warrant on her over here for murder that we need to deal with. So he was able to serve that warrant on her as well. We got it all taken care of to where everybody was formally charged. I was able to consult with our district attorney and said, I really want to do something more with this. I mean, obviously, they're concealing a human corpse within this apartment complex. They were transporting Schedule II narcotic into the state of West Virginia from Maryland. They had possession of a narcotic. We have distribution and delivery of a narcotic. We had a lot of charges that we were looking at doing. I said, but I feel like there has to be something more. I don't know if we can go the route of involuntary misdemeanor manslaughter or if we're going to take it a step further. So he starts to do some legal research, and he finds a case that's pre-existing on the West Virginia Supreme Court books that says you can charge somebody under this law for delivery of heroin that results in someone's death. He's looking over the case law and says, I got it. We have pre-existing precedents. We have pre-existing case law on this. Go ahead and charge him with murder one, first degree murder. So I'm able to tack that on to all the charges. And when we talk about, the court proceedings part of it, they try to tear me up in court on that. Why would you charge them with first degree murder? It's more of an involuntary manslaughter. You don't have a license to practice law. How are you able to decipher this case? It's already sitting on the Supreme Court books. And every time I had to just say, call the district attorney. I contacted him. He advised on which charges to go with. I cannot tell you. All I know is that in West Virginia, our lower level court is a magistrate court. And magistrates are elected officials, so they don't even have a law degree. A lot of them have a high school diploma, and they're elected by the people. They're our lower court judge that handles a lot of misdemeanors, and they do felony preliminary hearings. And if you're swearing out a warrant as a law enforcement officer, they're who assigns the warrant. So they don't have a legal background. When I got my warrants through the magistrate, they had to call the district attorney and say, this is a murder charge. Can I do this? And the district attorney would tell them, yes, on my authority, you can find probable cause in that charge, and he can charge him for that. I advised him to let that be one of his charges. So that was a huge hurdle that we had to keep jumping over, was for them to have me explain to them how under the color of the law I had a right to charge with murder one, and all I had to say was call the district attorney. I was advised by him that was an applicable charge.
There was really good research on their part to find that standing case, because I know in Kentucky that it's very difficult, and that's hard for surviving victims' families to understand. I remember when I was in the unit, specifically, I had a drug overdose of a young man. He was probably about 18 or 19. And I had many conversations with his mother on the phone, because her whole gist was go find out who gave him the drugs and charge him in that death. And especially back then, we had nothing. I know the most recent thing when I left the PD that we were doing successfully is on the federal side, there's an aggravator in trafficking. And it's not so much a murder charge, but for example, if you're found guilty of trafficking and it's proven and somebody has a serious injury or death, there's an aggravator on that trafficking charge. And we were seeing people get 60 to 80-year sentences, which ironically enough in Kentucky might mean more than if you shot somebody. So
Right.
that we were having a lot of success. But they take, just like you're talking about here, it takes a lot of work, because it's like any death scene investigation gets treated the same, hopefully, right? Because we don't know, but there's no lesser burden of proof or anything just because drugs are involved or somebody might have voluntarily taken it. So good research on their part.
It absolutely was. I was very impressed with that aspect of it. So at this point in time, we now have 2 out of the 4 witnesses that are telling me nobody's going to confess to it, but somebody had injected heroin into the victim's arm. She falls forward, hits her head, she dies. All of us collect the paraphernalia, and we leave the apartment complex and leave her in this room to take her last breaths, and she passes away and dies in this bedroom. All 3 were present, or all 4 rather, were present when this happened. They all were contributors to it in some form or factum. John Boyd drove him to Maryland, picked up the heroin, brought it back into the state of West Virginia with the aid of 2 others. Daisy had the apartment complex, the dwelling in which it was, permissible activity. It facilitated the murder or the overdose. Somebody, which later on I did find out it was Christina Nicole Pierce, was the one that actually injected the heroin into the victim's arm. Melissa Stewart helped clean up the heroin and brought it back out. So all of them were accessories in some form or another, which led all of them being charged with the murder one charge. At that point in time, we really didn't break it up when we went to court with the indictment as far as who's going to be an accessory before or after the fact and who's going to be the primary facilitator of the murder one charge. Across the board, all of them got the same exact charges.
Did Daisy get that as well?
So Daisy, I think the prosecutor was so overwhelmed with the fact that she cooperated and the investigation would not have been nearly solved to the level that it was if it weren't for Daisy. So Daisy actually ended up being charged with principal in the first degree to murder, which is more or less like an accessory charge, principal in the first degree to delivery of a controlled substance, and then felony conspiracy. So she did catch lesser offenses. They were all still felonies, but they were not as serious as a first-degree murder charge. And the actual, bringing the heroin into the state, they were more accessory charges.
With you having to wear all these hats in your community, from homicide investigator to every other thing you had to do since you all were so limited on police officers, who was in charge of going to Bobbie Jean's family to bear the bad news? Was that you?
That was also me.
Why don't you tell our listeners, because I think a lot of people don't realize that has to go home with you and know that how that you walked away from that family and their world just turned upside down because of news you just delivered. And I think a lot of people don't realize how that must make you feel, having seen that, giving them this horrible news that they're never going to recover from. My two-part question is, how did that go with that family? And how do you as an officer recover from, how do you just walk away and go to your next call? That's hard.
Those are very good questions. Unfortunately, with this scenario, it was something that I had a very hard time dealing with because their family lived about 45 minutes outside of my jurisdiction. And as I explained, being the only officer that's on duty, it kind of was one of those things in my jurisdiction where I kind of informed my chain of command I need to do a death notification. And they said, well, we got a whole lot of stuff going on. You're going to have to do it by phone. And that's not the way that I operate. I would rather do a death notice in person. I don't like doing them over the phone. But of course, you follow your orders, and made the phone call and had to tell her mother over the phone, have you talked to Bobbie lately? And she's like, no, but she's having some marital problems. She does have 2 kids. She went missing, which I think she's actually back on drugs again. She was clean for a while. And she gives me that whole entire backstory. Miss Black, I do have to inform you that we did find Bobbie's body. She is deceased. And of course, as soon as you know that as an officer, when you give a death notification, you know that you're instantly going to be silent because you're just going to be handed an onslaught of, just horrible emotions. And you just wait for your chance to try to console that individual to the best of your ability. And, after a long period of time on her on the phone with her crying and, just being grief stricken, I had to find that moment that, she finally got herself under control and said, can you tell me what happened? And I can't explain a lot. It's still an ongoing investigation. I can kind of just tell you that it is this, and, your suspicions were correct. She did, come back to heroin again. And, this is kind of what we're thinking. It's still too early to determine anything, but that's all I can really tell you. And just like Dave said, at that point, she's really, whoever gave it to him, I want him charged. I want him life in prison. I want him to put him under the jail and lock him up and throw away the key, kind of thing. And I told her, I'm in the process of working on that. I have suspects identified. I'm doing my job. I'm going to get justice for your daughter one way or another. I give you my word on that. And of course, she wants to know, who are they? I want to know their names. I want to know who they are. But I can't disclose that. I understand, you're a vengeful mother, you're upset, but I can't give that information. So that's very, very hard, especially, if you're one of those law enforcement officers that you have a family, you are a parent. Like me, I had family members that struggled with substance abuse. So I could feel where she was at, not that I was directly in her shoes, but I could empathize enough with her that I knew where she was coming from, and I was heartbroken for her and for her family. And at the end of the day, humanizing police officers, when we underneath that uniform, we're flesh and blood just like everybody else too. So you take that home and you hear this mother on the phone that's telling you, my daughter was always a good kid. She was always a straight A student. She was never in trouble. And then one day she got into heroin. And ultimately she tells me that, the only thing she had ever done was marijuana. And there's a lot of statistics out there and a lot of clinical studies that say that marijuana is a gateway drug. Other people say that it's not. I'll let that be up to our listeners to determine how they feel about that. And I'm not going to go into the physiology of whether or not it is or isn't a gateway drug. But she says, that's all she ever used was marijuana. And then out of the blue, one day, she's addicted to pills and she's shooting heroin into her arms. And we never saw that coming, from our little girl that never got into trouble, straight A student, to being a heroin addict. And then you go home and you hug your kids twice as hard thinking, that's my kid. My kid's honor roll. My kid's a straight A student. He's a great kid. Is he going to hit 25 and get on a wrong path? And I'm going to be getting this call on him saying that he's dead in somebody's apartment complex one day. It's very hard to deal with that trauma of being a law enforcement officer and seeing what you see daily, knowing you have to go home, process it, deal with it, wake up the next morning, and the first thing you might get is a serious domestic assault or a 3-car vehicle accident where someone's dead, with the crash. It's very hard to process that, and law enforcement officers do not receive enough credit for having to process that emotion very quickly. That's why a lot of them do bottle it up and they tuck it down inside, and then later on it comes out through repressed trauma and it's substance abuse, or they have problems with their marriage and officer-related suicide, and they make mistakes on the job, and because they're just emotionally charged. All those things happen because of suppressed trauma, ultimately.
Yeah, I don't think people really think behind the scenes of that. And, aside of the writing the tickets and arresting people for DUI, I don't think people realize that part of the job that the officer has to do. And like you said, you go to bed, think about it, you wake up thinking about it, and then maybe you go out and there's a wreck and there's an infant that was killed in the car wreck, and you got to go tell the mom that the babysitter was driving him and you don't have a baby anymore. And all that stuff just adds up and builds. And I certainly, empathize and can't imagine having to do that. And I don't know that a lot of people realize that is part of your all's job, not just wearing the badge and going home and it all just falls apart when you get home, and it's a whole different life. It's not like that. But, and then again with Bobbie Jean, you have her mother's grief, and now the mother has to tell the husband, who's probably trying to work out the marriage, maybe not, but then who's going to tell the 2 children? Right. And that just spirals out of control. And, with these people, when they get addicted to these drugs, and they may not have those intentions of thinking, well, it's just once with heroin, I'm not going to be addicted. And then ultimately you just wish that they could see the grief on the mother's face, or like with yourself, having to hang up that phone call and feel so empty knowing the news you just delivered. You just wish that they could say, I'm not going to do that. I don't think people realize what an effect it has on everybody. And that drug's so horrible because it gets a hold of them and they can't even shake it.
Yeah. And see, and I was one of those officers. I took, my oath, I took my patch and my badge very, very seriously, to the utmost integrity that I could possibly produce, even on my worst day where, an officer has his problems that he's dealing with at home. And, we have bad days like everybody else too, but I always made it a point not to do anything that would ever tarnish or stain my badge or my patch or my integrity. And, I was one of those people that obviously I got into law enforcement to help my community. When I became an officer, I made $11.05 an hour. I obviously did not do it for the money. I did it because I loved my community. I cared about my community. I wanted to help people. So it really did break my heart to not be able to be at her residence and catch her and hug her when I had to deliver the death notification. It was very hard for me to have to come to terms with doing that over the telephone.
Did you ever, after that, were you able to tell her that you were able to make these arrests on her daughter's behalf? Hey, there's more to the story, so go download the next episode like the true crime fan that you are.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, which is our website, and it has show notes for imagery and audio and video files related to the cases you're going to hear. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn, and YouTube, which has closed caption available for those that are hearing impaired. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you download your podcast from. Subscribe to the Murder Police Podcast and set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.